Welcome. Thank you for joining us on the 6th week of the Ubuntu Symposium. And yeah, we look forward to having you throughout the session. And thank you for joining once again. So this is the 6th week, and this is the first plenary of the week. And we will be looking into the feminist activism encounters masculinities and lessons and effect of coloniality in the work that we do on transforming masculinities and engaging boys and men. And so before we start the session, we wanted to let you know that we have three live interpretation happening in 3 different languages. And for that, you can if you look the bottom of the screen, you will see a little globe button, and it calls interpretation. If you click, you will see 3 languages that will pop up, and please select the language you are comfortable with, so that you hear the audio in the appropriate language that is preferred for you. So you can do that right now, so that you start listening that language should English not be your preferred language. And you need to continue in the same channel, so that when anyone speaks in a different language, you will continue hearing the live interpretation in the language of your preference. So we are also doing Facebook Live today. So this was for another one. So feel free to look for MenEngage Facebook page, and there you will see the live interpretation happening. And also, please follow us on the social media. If you are active, feel free to post your own messages, and using this hashtag Ubuntu Symposium, so that it gets connected with the broader social media mobilization that is happening around the global symposium. And yeah, so in terms of the conversations, and we would encourage each one of you as participants also to feel free to use chat box from your end to engage with the conversation. And we really want this conversation to be a candid, political, insightful conversation as much as possible, so that we can collectively have a meaningful conversation to further shape the work around transforming masculinities, but also related to the current situation where you are, including COVID-19 and the backlash and the rising nationalism and so on that we are experiencing these days. And then also, obviously, the speakers will also try to make it relevant to the themes of the symposium that we are looking at, but also use simple language and avoid any jargons in your presentation or conversation, so that we have an accessible language to general public. And with that, I will now hand it over to Mangesh Kulkarni, who is the professor and head of the Department of Political Sciences and Public Administration in Savitribai, Phule, Pune University, and who is also the moderator for the session today. So over to you, Mangesh.
Yeah, thank you, Lakshman. Now, let me say something about the nature of this session. Lakshman has already explained to us a few things. So let me repeat some of them very quickly. The theme of this session is Feminist Activism Encounters Masculinities. And to look at various dimensions of this theme, we have 2 speakers, and of course I'm playing the role of the moderator. Now the speakers are, one is Mwiine Amon, who is from Uganda, who's a professor there, and you will hear from him. He will also say something about himself, and so also the second speaker will introduce herself, and she is Vanessa Fonseca from Brazil. So these are our 2 main speakers, and the structure of this session roughly is going to be like this. First, as I said, very quickly, the speakers will introduce themselves, and then thereafter, I will explain uh, the sort of background of this session, and says something about a particular book, a volume, an edited volume that came out of the previous MenEngage Global Symposium that happened in Delhi, India in 2014. So, this is a book that consists of some of the papers that were presented in that symposium. So, I will say something about that particular book to get the discussion going in today's session. Right. So, and thereafter, of course, the speakers will take over. They will address uh, two interrelated themes. Vanessa will speak on an analysis of the effects of coloniality on male transformation strategies, and Amon will speak on feminist activism encounters masculinities, lessons on engaging men in gender equality. Thereafter, essentially, there'll be some kind of interaction between the two speakers. I will also join the dialogue. Further on, we will take questions from the chat box if there are any, and then again, we will sort of have another final round before we wrap up this session. So it's essentially, the two speakers. I will be playing the role of facilitator, and I have been given just a little extra responsibility. Moderator that way is not normally supposed to say much, but as I explained to you, I'll be saying something about the book, and then also sort of express my own views on this larger theme and what transpires from the presentations of the two speakers. So roughly, this is the sort of structure we have for today, for this session. Right. So, may I now invite first Vanessa and then Amon to very quickly, in say about 2 minutes, say something about themselves, and then thereafter, perhaps I will say a few words about myself. So, Vanessa, please.
Hola, un saludo a todas las personas que están con nosotros. Yo voy a hablar en español. Agradezco mucho la oportunidad de hablar en este debate. Mi nombre es Vanessa Fonseca, soy brasileña y trabajo hace 20 años con investigación e intervención con hombres por la equidad de género. La presentación de hoy en Simposio Ubuntu es una parte de la tesis de doctorado, donde analicé mi propia experiencia de trabajo por el involucramiento de los hombres en la equidad de género en países del sur global. Este trabajo se realizó en base a una demanda común sobre cómo transformar masculinidades, considerada una forma eficaz de promover relaciones más respetuosas entre hombres y mujeres. Mi objetivo hoy no es responder a esta pregunta, pero reflejar sobre las fuerzas y relaciones de poder que están presentes en esta demanda con base en el debate feminista de colonial interseccional. El trabajo de tesis produjo muchas líneas de análisis. Me centraré en unos pocos ejes para cumplir con el tiempo de presentación. La línea principal, yo creo, es la producción individualizadora de prácticas de transformación de masculinidad, que es una de las características de muchos de estos trabajos que son compartidos entre los diferentes países. Voy a analizar esta característica. Gracias.
Yeah, thank you, Vanessa. Now, Amon.
Thank you so much, everyone who is on this platform. And thank you, Ubuntu, for creating this opportunity for us to share from different parts of the globe. I'm called Amon Ashaba Mwiine. I'm a lecturer at the School of Women and Gender Studies in Makerere University, Uganda. I teach on 2 course units in Makerere. I teach gender and sexuality. I teach men's studies, masculinities, and development. I have a PhD in sociology, but the topic of the research was focusing on male promoters of gender equality in parliament in Uganda. And male promoters, I was looking at male MPs who were often in alliance with women speaking to issues of gender equality. So and then I am a research fellow at the moment in the College of Humanities and Social Sciences, and the fellowship is supported by Andrew Mellon Foundation, and that is where I am doing the work on historicizing feminist activism and looking at how that has encountered notions on men and masculinity.
Thank you, Amon. As for myself, I'm Mangesh Kulkarni, and I have been interested in what has now come to be called critical masculinity studies since I've been interested in this field and I've been working in this field since the mid 90s. That means nearly a quarter century. And that also led me a little beyond reading, writing, research, etc. And I have been, since the 90s, actually late 90s, I have been also associated with pro-feminist men's groups. As a result of that, in 2007, I was one of the founder members of a country network that was launched in India, and that's called the Forum to Engage Men, FEM. And this network has been a part of the global MenEngage Alliance. And as a result of which, actually, we eventually hosted in this country the second global symposium, the MenEngage Symposium, the one that occurred prior to this one. We hosted in Delhi, and I was involved in organizing it. And I've also, of course, been doing research in this area. I've been publishing, and I have also introduced a master's level course on the politics of masculinities, and that's in my university. So I've been teaching that course for now nearly a decade. So essentially, this is about myself in short. And as I said to you earlier, basically my role here is that of the moderator. But I will be also speaking about this book which I mentioned, which came out of the previous symposium. And I will, in addition to facilitating the discussion here, I will also comment on perhaps on what will be said by the two main speakers, and perhaps respond to some questions raised by those who would be posting their questions in the chat box. So essentially, that's going to be my role. And now we move on to the next stage. Now here, I would like to invite first, as I said, Vanessa, to make her presentation. And that the theme, as I said, is an analysis of the effects of coloniality on male transformation strategies. This is obviously a very important a theme, particularly for those of us who live and work in what used to be called the third world, now called the global south. And many of us were actually previously colonized, and we also know very well that though colonialism in the formal sense ended a long time ago, and particularly in the region where Vanessa comes from, it ended, I think, nearly 200 years ago, over 200 years ago. And yet, the colonial hangover persists in many, many domains. And so this is a very relevant topic now. And she has 10 minutes for her presentation. So, Vanessa, please.
Ok. Yo voy a pedir que Lexman ponga la presentación, por favor. Entonces, el título, Mangesh ha hablado, un análisis de los efectos de la colonialidad en estrategias de transformación de masculinidades. El próximo, por favor. Yo hablé sobre esto, que es una presentación basada en mi experiencia con hombres, mi experiencia sobre el involucramiento de los hombres en diferentes países del sur, con base en una pregunta común, que es ¿cómo transformar las masculinidades? El próximo, por favor. La presentación tiene 3 partes. Yo voy a presentar un breve escenario de trabajo con hombres en el contexto global. Después, problemas o preguntas que surgieron durante las prácticas de intervención registrados en diarios de campo, en que utilicé la etnografía y cartografía como herramienta de evaluación de los trabajos, y por fin algunas orientaciones de análisis con base en lecturas del feminismo decolonial interseccional. No voy a presentar mucho sobre el feminismo decolonial interseccional, pero voy a intentar hacer cuestiones con base en estas lecturas. Por favor, el próximo. El próximo, sí. Respecto del breve escenario, desde la década de 70, los estudios sobre masculinidades ganan impulso, especialmente en los Estados Unidos. No es que los hombres no fueran un tema de análisis o de estudios, pero en la década de 70 los hombres ganan una otra manera de ser estudiados, impulsionados por la posguerra y por los movimientos feministas de LGBTQI+. Los hombres también comenzaron a cuestionar sus identidades masculinas. Diferentes grupos motivados por diferentes perspectivas comenzaron a reunirse para discutir la construcción de masculinidades y sus efectos, en los cuales los más comunes en los análisis de muchos autores, como Oliveira en Brasil, Pierce en Estados Unidos, son los liberacionistas, el mito poético y profeministas. Yo menciono estos enfoques porque yo creo que sus análisis todavía están presentes en muchos trabajos que yo puedo ver, incluso en Brasil de ahora. Estos enfoques alternan entre convocar a los hombres por el costo de las normas de género también para los hombres o por sus privilegios. Por favor, el próximo. El próximo slide, el próximo diapositiva. El anterior, sí. En la década de 90 se comenzaron a financiar prácticas y proyectos sociales. Era un momento de financiación para la prevención del VIH, del debate sobre la globalización y el desarrollo sostenible. Era también el momento de las grandes conferencias en las que reconocidos autores de las masculinidades eran llamados a reflexionar sobre el papel de los hombres en la promoción de la salud sexual y reproductiva, según las análisis de Margaret Arilla, una compañera de Brasil. Sin embargo, el trabajo para la transformación de las masculinidades se extendió globalmente a través de la cooperación entre organizaciones de la sociedad civil, en que el debate sobre la masculinidad fue integrado con diferentes temáticas. Yo fui llamada para hablar sobre cómo transformar masculinidades, por ejemplo, para promover la prevención de VIH o para promover la prevención de violencia, para promover cambios económicos, etc. El próximo diapositiva, por favor. La próxima, sí. El financiamiento creó la necesidad de controlar los resultados. Se iniciaron muchos debates en torno a esto, en los cuales los cambios de comportamiento y actitudes han adquirido protagonismo. Los cambios de comportamiento machista y actitudes fueron los horizontes del trabajo. Cambiar masculinidades era cambiar comportamientos y actitudes. Escalas para medir actitudes y comportamientos fueron usadas como prueba del resultado de este trabajo transformador de género. Se construyeron una serie de técnicas, campañas de marketing social, ejercicios grupales que ensayaron comportamientos más equitativos baseados en modelos de masculinidad. Este fue el escenario que atravesó las demandas del proyecto de transformación de masculinidades en los países del sur global que yo participé. Pero el próximo, por favor, sobre las preguntas que el campo me ponía. Mi pregunta era, ¿qué es transformar masculinidades? ¿Es la transformación un proceso final o las transformaciones es un proceso que hace parte de la vida? ¿Es un proceso mismo de la intervención? ¿Hay como hablar de un nombre transformado? ¿Esto es un deseo de nosotros o es un nombre en proceso de transformación? ¿Quién define el hombre de la transformación? ¿Qué comportamientos son apropiados de dónde? Estas son cuestiones de Avtabra, por ejemplo, una feminista muy importante de los estudios de coloniales también. Entiendo que el problema de género es la normatividad heterosexual, masculina, blanca, ejercida de manera rígida, que modela hombres y mujeres de forma hierárquica entre masculinidades y feminilidades. Entonces, la cuestión para mí era cómo podemos promover modelos justos de relación sin seguir la misma lógica normativa de impor modelos. La relación entre norte global y sur global también me era una cuestión. El sur aporta experiencia y el norte aporta herramientas de análisis y trabajo. Este es un diálogo con Colonial, por ejemplo, que también dice lo mismo. Mi discurso y prácticas eran baseadas en el norte para adaptarse a los financiamientos, a las demandas de los financiamientos, quiero decir. Pero la próxima diapositiva, por favor. En el campo, el problema del joven negro con quien yo trabajaba y que era una persona amable y sumisa, era hacer que los demás no le temieran por ser un hombre joven negro. Era asegurarse que las personas no se escapen de él en la calle o no ser perseguido por los guardias de seguridad por ser un joven negro. Entonces, la cuestión de raza era muy importante en este sentido. Algunos hombres no querían ser hombres nuevos, sino mujeres trans. Y el tiempo de cambio no era el tiempo del proyecto, era un tiempo lento que no cabía en las demandas que nos hacían de evaluación, por ejemplo. Los cambios ocurrieron principalmente en los encuentros entre los jóvenes. Yo percibía que el primer momento era una reproducción de mi discurso sobre qué los hombres debían hacer. Solamente cuando la experiencia o alguna cosa de los encuentros los afectaba, es que ellos se apropiaban del nuevo discurso y ellos empezaron a hacer su propio trabajo en la causa de las transformaciones de masculinidad o en la causa de la equidad de género. La próxima, por favor. La próxima, por favor. Todavía sobre las cuestiones del campo, el debate sobre el involucramiento de los hombres estaba principalmente centrado en las ideas de costos o privilegios como estrategia de participación. Y algunos autores también señalan este tema. Para mí, esto debe estar fuera de discusión. Los dos van juntos, no es una cosa u otra. Es decir, las dos cosas son importantes. La transformación es de las fuerzas, también de los procesos de construcción. Estar centrado solamente en costos o en los privilegios es un reflejo de una práctica individualizadora, que es una palabra también nueva en portugués, y moralizante. Yo uso la palabra individualizadora porque el problema no es las acciones individuales, pero las acciones que centradas en el individuo olvidan las fuerzas de las relaciones que constituyen este individuo. Algunos otros autores también señalan que el movimiento masculino estaba centrado en las transformaciones personales, sobre todo. El modelo ecológico, que era una teoría de mudanza que usábamos y que piensa teóricamente en las transformaciones al nivel individual, comunitario, social, institucional, se concentraba también en políticas y acciones enfocadas en el individuo, por ejemplo, en estrategias que cambiaban a los individuos, a los hombres, principalmente en el espacio privado. Por tanto, una propuesta aún individualizadora. Por favor, la próxima diapositiva. El problema, el problema no era el trabajo individual, sino una política individualizadora. Hay un autor que dice que en el norte global hemos pensado en el género como un síntoma, intentamos curarlo rápidamente. También se ha reflejado esto en la producción de pensamiento crítico. El debate centrado todavía también en la división público-privado era una cosa muy, muy fuerte. Por otro lado, las autoras feministas de coloniales afirman que el machismo que se refiere al comportamiento es un problema, claro, pero es necesario ir más allá. El problema del patriarcado no es en verdad la captura de las posibilidades creativas de la existencia. Para finalizar, por favor, la próxima diapositiva. Las pautas de análisis. Entonces, yo pienso que para hablar de las transformaciones de género, debe ir más allá, de la transformación del comportamiento. Se trata de liberar las posibilidades creativas de la existencia de todas las personas, con críticas al sistema económico y cultural. El problema no es el trabajo individual, pero una perspectiva individualizadora, no descentralizada, que no descentraliza las masculinidades. Las teorías y los modelos son herramientas, pero no pueden ser horizontes de transformación. Y la transformación es un proceso, es movimiento, no se puede capturar por puntos de llegada. Es necesario un análisis crítico constante de nuestros lugares en el mundo. En la diapositiva final, por favor. La próxima. Entonces, no se trata de pensar si los hombres deben involucrarse en el debate de género, porque hay costos para él o por sus privilegios, un tema que ha tomado tiempo en el diálogo entre feministas y hombres comprometidos con las transformaciones de género. Es necesario analizar nuestros lugares en el mundo, así como privilegios y dolores, más allá de los comportamientos individuales. Se trata de cómo las estructuras sociales y políticas favorecen determinados discursos y lenguajes, universalizando estos discursos. Las masculinidades están ligadas a una racionalidad política, a un sistema normativo que ha sobrevivido a su articulación con el racismo y los sistemas económicos. Las transformaciones no se limitan a modelos de hombres que pueden cambiar el mundo, los héroes. Yo creo que esto fue un problema de Brasil, que eligió el mito del presidente que algunas personas pensaban que iría salvar. En las últimas elecciones intentábamos elegir una persona, un héroe para salvar el país. Pero es eso, gracias, disculpe si me demoré un poco más. Gracias por escuchar.
Yeah, thank you very much, Vanessa. You've raised very many pertinent issues, and we'll take them up for further discussion. I must quickly point out at this stage that I have taken a slight liberty in my role as moderator. I was supposed to say something about the book at the outset, but I have not done it deliberately. And I want to hear both of you so that I can avoid the repetition. Rather than my saying something at the outset and then sort of leaving it to you to avoid repetition, I thought I would play that role. So after Amon, I will of course say a little bit about my book, and then we will have some kind of interaction before we around these themes before we open it up to questions from the chat box, etc. So please, Amon, now we are eager to hear you for about 10 minutes. We are lagging behind a little bit, I realize, but it's okay. I'll take less time later. Fine.
Okay. Thank you so much, Mangesh. And there is the work that I'm looking at, Feminist Activism Encounters Masculinities. This is a historical study that I am doing at Makerere University, looking at the feminist history and the particular junctures in which we see feminist activism picking up on issues on men and engaging with the question of masculinity. Next slide, please. Next slide. So I note there that since independence, feminism in Africa and Uganda in particular has had, I think there has been a quick shift of slides. Oh, okay, yeah, on that one. That feminism in Africa and Uganda in particular has had different waves and critical agendas. So I take that historical approach and look at particular junctures in that history to look at how feminism has often engaged with the question of men and masculinity, but particularly looking at the kind of narratives that are often set off when feminist activism, engages with the question of men and masculinities, and try to assess the implications that those kind of encounters have for critical feminist theory and practice. Next slide, please. Next slide. There has been a jump in there, but I can follow through. So basically, I look at the history around 1920s to 40s. Within there, women's activism took the form of voluntary, Christian-centered, community development-oriented women's clubs. And these ones had Mothers Union, Girl Guide associations, and Young Women Christian Association at the heart of collective mobilization. So we tended to look at these collective efforts, bringing together wives of colonial administrators, missionaries, and students of King's College Woodrow. That was a colonial established high school. So men who went there, their wives were part of these informal groups that took their agenda around girls' education, family welfare, and used these spaces to train fellow women in home management, in childcare, and nurturing, and nutrition. And when you look at the literature around that time, it brings forth a relationship between women and the state that projects pervasive marginalization. Women taking a secondary status, as you can see in the language there, as it appears in the history. Women are commonly referred to as wives and mothers and sisters, rather than other independent identities that they would take. So you find multiple forms of oppression that women find themselves in. Capital colonial state promoting domesticity. You have the Victorian culture. Uganda was under the colonial rule of the British. Victorian culture on the press of women, but also traditional culture where chiefs were a bit uncomfortable with girls getting education because they thought they would become unmarriageable. So in some ways, you have that pervasive form of women's oppression becoming the central focus of activism, and women becoming the sort of subjects within the gender discourse at that time. Next slide, please. So you have in 1997 women forming another umbrella from the voluntary organizations to an umbrella women's organization called Uganda Council for Women, and this was largely protesting women's secondary status under colonialism in the politics, but also looking at the oppression that women were going through at the household level, without, lacking inheritance rights, lacking opportunities to education, and that kind of thing. So you had a kind of feminism in which women were the central subject, which in some ways named women's oppression and highlighted it as something that needed to be addressed. Next, please. I'm going to skip that one also, if you can move next. And move another one next. Next, please. Okay, I wanted to come to speed, given the time that Mangesh has on the watch, looking at feminist activism and the question of where men were. And that question of where are the men in the women's movement became very active in 1990s. On that slide that you see, in 1990s, two waves of activism that we saw were around violence against women, and the other one was around women and environment. And this seemed to be closely related with the global conversations, because in 1992, we had the activism on environment stemming from a Rio de Janeiro conference. I wanted to look at how in the movement, one of the publications brings forth a voice from an activist, saying that as a result of political, social, and economic changes, Ugandan women, like their counterparts in the rest of Africa, have invaded and penetrated what used to be purely male-dominated activities, such as rock excavation, in order to sustain themselves and their families. So we start looking at activism that had started creating impact on the lives of women, and women breaking into spheres that were male-dominated. But what I problematize in that is that while such kind of activism was revealing women's forms of marginalization, there were certain forms of silences that we started experiencing around possibilities of male vulnerability to similar health hazards that women activists were requiring the government to respond in terms amongst women. So you had activists demanding government to address risks of new female entrants in the quarrying industry that rotated around body cuts from log fragments, common incidents of malaria. But then you could not see articulation of possibilities of male vulnerability to similar health hazards, especially given that men were dominantly and historically engaged in that quarrying industry. Next slide, please. Next slide. And the same thing applies to domestic violence or violence against women. And the idea of violence against women was also raging in Uganda. And women activists did a great deal to reveal forms of violence that would have not seen the light of day, that were legitimized in some sense, because a husband beating their wife was in some ways seen as normal and acceptable. But this kind of violence against this activism brought forth that idea of violence is domestic, it is private issue that can be handled amongst members there. It brought it into the public realm, and women used those cartoon caricatures that you saw in the last slide, which had a combination of humor, but also did the function of bringing forth something that would have been seen as normal, and in some ways naming violence in strong ways within the public. But you then start seeing the central focus on women as subjects of the gender discourse, keeping silent on possibility of male violence or on wide experiences of different categories of women at the time. So you have silences around male vulnerability to violence, but you also have a narrow focus because women became sort of a category, universal category, and we did not see wider opportunities of looking at different, categories of women at that time. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, so in addition to violence and the silence around men's experiences of violence, we started seeing questions of where are the men in all this. In 1995, there was a Beijing conference in China, and one of the biggest questions that was encountered the men who came from Uganda to the conference was, why are you here? This is a men's conference. This is a women's conference. And so the question of who the men were in feminist activism became sort of something that was kept silent at some point, but at the same time, resurrected, especially as we moved into from women in development to gender and development. And of course, that symbol of balancing the scales was dominantly drawn upon by the Ministry of Women in Development in Uganda as the aspect of addressing gender. So there was much focus on balancing that scale, and the focus meant that all the investment, all the activism went on the side of women. And in some ways, this approach reproduced gender in polarized ways. We started looking at women and men as polar opposites. And that created polarities and limited possibilities of engaging with different categories and identities that men embody, but also different identities that women embodied. And so we started looking at gender crystallizing into women's issues. So every time you talked about gender, it's sort people quickly looked at women without looking at different categories of women, without looking at possibilities of engaging men in that conversation. Next slide, please. And then the turn to male involvement. I call that the turn to male involvement because I'm looking at the 2000s in which there is an increased focus on men and male involvement in promoting gender equality. Right from 1994 International Conference on Population and Development to 2014 when UN Women launched He for She campaign, you start looking at an activism that is moving towards asking, where are the men? How can we tap into their power, their numerical presence in public to support the advocacy for gender equality? And while that itself was not problematic in its own way, we started looking at the language that came with that, the language of using men to empower women and girls that had aspects of instrumentalism. But we also, as Vanessa has said, we also started looking at strategies focusing on male involvement in HIV without necessarily focusing on men as subjects of this focus, but rather looking at how we can use men to stop HIV or using men to stop infections to women and girls, and also using men to prevent GBV. These strategies became common in Uganda. So what I noticed that at some point you would meet strategies that are not necessarily focusing on men because they have an issue that needs to be addressed, but rather focusing on men as a means of achieving something else. And then we had a very recent turn to positive masculinity. I've had 3 women's rights organizations calling upon me to talk to come and give a lecture on positive masculinities. And the kind of activism around that is that positive masculinities is flagged as if there are 2 forms of masculinities, positive and negative. And within that activism and conversation, you also do not hear how these masculinities relate with femininities. So there's you will hardly hear a conversation about femininities and whether they are multiple and whether there could be certain elements of negative femininities that we might need to transform or positive femininities that we might need to draw upon. So we have also seen that concept of positive masculinities narrowing the scope of understanding the complexity of masculinities as a relational category. And so I look at this turn and acknowledge that while this kind of activism has created visibility to women's issues that could have previously been kept silent and created opportunities for speaking to issues of gender equity, there are certain inadvertent effects that have tended to crop up with these strategies that at some point could threaten reproducing forms of inequality that we intended to address in the first place. For instance, celebrating men as champions of gender equality. And the questions that I meet in academia, in research is, if we celebrate certain categories of men as champions, do we have a point where we can hold them to account in case they are no longer supportive of gender equity? That kind of thing. Next slide, please, as I conclude. And so the common question that you meet within the activism and research is certain sections of people wondering whether this is a voice from one of the Zoom meetings on the role of positive masculinities at Makerere University. One of the participants asked, I keep wondering why most studies of men and about men have always studied men as a category, or even as a problem that needs to be fixed if we are to attain domestic harmony. Do we have the right conceptualization of the problem? Is there a need to rethink the questions we ask? What are the implications of framing and studying men as a category or as a problem that needs to be fixed? I know there have been debates about positive masculinities, but even then, the framing of positive masculinities reinforces same notions around categorizations, a wandering novice. And so in there, this sort of brings the thread of the silences, but also the problematic engagement that we have seen in activism in Uganda. For many people, the dominant gender discourses constitute men as unintelligible, that we cannot imagine them as beneficiaries of gender equity. For others, where feminist activism moved into male involvement, some of the engagement strategies maintained women and girls as the central focus of analysis and focused on men in instrumental ways through the language of using men to empower women. I don't know whether you have seen some of these statements. And then for other cases, we have seen ambiguities, we have seen polarities, we have seen silences and instrumental narratives that have come to characterize some of the strategies in male involvement. And I argue that these sometimes inadvertently constrain dialogue and diversity and the celebration of difference when we look at gender as about women here and silences around men. The last slide as I conclude. So in terms of lessons, if we can move to the last slide. The lessons that I'm drawing from this historical study are around looking at possibilities of moving beyond looking at women here and men here as social categories that are opposed to each other. And I'm saying that perhaps we could start by examining men as subjects of gender power relations. Because in the history of activism that I have seen in Uganda, there isn't that central and critical focus on men as gendered and looking at how men become products of social processes just like women and femininities are. And the other question I ask is that perhaps we need to rethink and reimagine masculinities as a critical approach towards transformation of gender relations, rather than as oppositional to feminism. And I was thinking that the entry point to that could be looking at the possibilities of asking what men stand to gain from gender equality. Is there anything that men could benefit from gender equality? Just like the history has indicated that women from different positions of vulnerability have a lot to benefit from gender equity. I thought that these questions could usher us into a much more critical approach in which we start examining experiences of men as part of gender discourse. And in that way, we can widen possibilities of looking at how femininities and masculinities are produced within our social settings. I want to stop there. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Amon. Now, actually, I feel particularly glad that I did not begin by actually talking about the book and taking up those 10 minutes, because I realized that we are lagging behind by something like almost half an hour, and that worries me slightly. So what I will do is two things. One is that the sort of program outline, run of show, shared with us gave me two slots where I would be talking about the book in a certain sense. So I'm going to combine these two actually, okay, and take less time. So in the first slot, I was supposed to say something about what that book has to offer, and then in the next slot, I was supposed to say how the discourse around masculinities and gender, how that discourse has moved on in the last half a decade or so. But I'll now sort of combine these two sorts of concerns before I once again invite Vanessa and Amon to sort of open up other aspects of this larger theme of feminist activism encountering masculinities. Now about the book itself. See, this is the book. I suppose you can see this perhaps. So this book, which is called Global Masculinities, Interrogations and Reconstructions. This is a book that, as I said, came out of the our last previous global symposium. So you know, therefore, one looks at it in two ways. On the as the editor of the book, I had on the one hand there was this advantage that this symposium had brought together people from around the world, from I think something like almost 100 countries. There were nearly 1,000 participants and so on. All the virtually all the continents were represented. So there, we had quite a variety of papers and people presenting papers from different parts of the world. But then again, the book would necessarily have to consist of papers presented there in that forum. So in that sense, there was also a restriction, and further, we couldn't include all the papers. And in some cases, people had published their papers. They eventually published their papers elsewhere. In the academic field, particularly, people want to publish quickly, and books take a longer time. So some of them went to journals and so on and so forth. So okay, fine. So these were the opportunities as well as restrictions. Eventually, as it turned out, this book, which runs into something like 230 odd pages, and of which there is also a paperback edition here in particularly in South Asia, and there is a hardbound international edition. What I showed you is the South Asia edition. So this book eventually features, including the my editorial introduction. It includes about 14 articles, and in addition, of course, there is prefatory material. And here I would like to particularly point out the preface, which I invited Rabin Connell to contribute, and I am really grateful that she responded to this request and very promptly provided an excellent, uh, comprehensive, uh, but concise preface, which tracks the history of masculinity studies, the history of feminism, and especially feminist inspired academic and activist modes of engaging with masculinities, and what are the challenges that we are facing today. So actually, I would really say that if somebody wants to look at this book but doesn't have much time, then perhaps that person should really read Connell's preface. As you know, Connell happens to be, I would say, not only a pioneer, but perhaps the one person who has done more than anybody else to shape this field of critical masculinity studies and to take it in a truly progressive sort of direction. I'm really tempted to talk, especially after listening to Amon, and positive masculinities, etc. I was really tempted to say something about a couple of key concepts developed by Connell, but perhaps right now I'll resist that temptation. So what I'll just do now is to save time. very quickly give you a sort of a kind of bird's eye view of what this book presents. And I must say, it is kind of that collection is a bit motley and sort of miscellaneous, but it does represent people, scholars, activists, etc., from 5 continents around the world. And I believe that it is. I have seen other books of a similar nature with a global scope, which talk about masculinities, but I do not think I have seen any book that emanated from a forum like this, which is truly representative, and especially a forum where the global South has a very major sort of representation. And the book itself was put together in that sense in India, in the global South. So, whereas most of the other books of this kind have come from the North. So that I think is an interesting feature. Now, very quickly, this it begins with an extremely well-researched piece by South African woman scholar Nolwazi Mkwanzi, who talks about certain kinds of rites of passage. Anthropologists call them rites of passage or rites of initiation. Where when the transition from boyhood to manhood. Many societies have sort of rites of passage around this. And she talks about certain kinds of initiation rites that happen that are common especially amongst the Xhosa people there in South Africa, and she writes about them very critically. It involves circumcision and other sorts of cruel and unhygienic practices, and she talks about the attempts to stop these kinds of practices. She even tells us that there is a law now, and that law was passed nearly 20 years ago. And when she wrote it, when we published it, that was about more than a decade ago that law had been passed, but it has had very little effect. So it just shows you that simply trying to bring about change through or by legal means, that's not enough. Uh, Further, the next essay in that book by Sanjeev Upreti, who's actually a professor in Nepal, he by the way, he teaches English literature, and that also shows you how interdisciplinary or rather multidisciplinary this book is. So Mkwanzi is an anthropologist, and Upreti teaches English literature, but he has been writing on gender and masculinities. And essentially, what he's saying is that uh, it's not just the law or uh, even activism by itself which can bring about changes, because patriarchy is so deeply entrenched in a range of institutions. He actually gives us data gathered by him from what goes on in police stations, law courts, voluntary agencies, media, etc. And he, points out that they are so suffused with masculinist norms that, say, for example, taking women for granted, or displaying a certain kind of aggression when men deal with women in different spaces. It's so common because it's considered to be normal. So how does one fight this? Something which is as deeply entrenched as this. And that is the challenge that he highlights, Sanjeev Upreti. Then we have another very scholarly piece by Hannah Wright, who actually has expertise in the study of international relations, and she's looking at different ways in which attempts have been made to resolve interstate conflicts, and provides, I think, very insightful feminist critique of the limitations of these sorts of approaches to conflict resolution, and also explains what would be a truly feminist informed kind of approach to conflict resolution. Then we have a piece by Shashish Kamal on Bangladesh, which is in South Asia, and where the author talks about, on the basis of a systematic survey that was conducted there, This article talks about these different ways in which young men, especially college-going youth, male youth, they behave in violent ways towards women. Their perceptions of women, and how this has kind of become a part of the sort of male youth culture. Negative attitudes towards women and negative forms of behavior towards women are how they are entrenched, and how one can overcome this. Then there is a jointly authored piece by Sandy Ruxton and her colleagues, and which is about the role played by peers, uh, right, in mentoring young men. Peers and also some um, people who are seen as role models, who are supposed to serve as role models, and how they uh, can constructively mentor youth. Then we have a piece by Baron Oron and Alice Wellborn, uh, and this is very unusual. It is grounded in a very different kind of approach, and that's the sort of it's a neurobiological strategy that they're talking about. uh, that strategy which seeks to essentially change men, what actually Amon was calling, creating positive masculinity, etc. And in fact, this is uh, precisely in Uganda, that perhaps then subsequently Amon would say something about this. So there were these sort of prolonged 9-month long sort of training through work series of workshops using a neurobiological approach, and how they tried to create a sort of violence free and sort of masculinity where men would learn to behave in a far more positive, humane way towards women, and how they would also share, uh, you know, uh, their different kinds of chores that were otherwise earlier seen as uh, women's work, etc., etc. Then there's another piece which also talks about a region of Africa that includes Burundi, the Republic of Congo, and Rwanda. And this is authored by Prabhu Deepan and Liz Lutz. And here they talk about again something that's very interesting, and that is the use of religion, which often tends to, in fact, uh, bolster traditional forms of masculinity and patriarchy. We often see that. But here they are trying to talk about how, in fact, a sort of something like a liberation theology was used precisely to reconstruct masculinities along constructive lines. And then there is a piece by Michael Flood, who many of us know about him. I think he's a scholar who's been working in this field for a long time. And he writes about, I think, very pertinently about the limitations of many of the approaches that are typically used to combat men's violence against women, and why many of these efforts and approaches tend to be rather shallow, and why they do not produce the kind of impact that they should be producing. So uh, that is what he does. And then there are articles. The next piece is by Sana Contractor and her colleagues, and it's essentially about. It focuses on state in India and talks about men's participation in contraception, and why it is limited, and what can be done to enhance men's participation and men's ownership and sense of responsibility in this very key field. The next one again is by two Indian authors, Neha Makkad and Meera Sadgopal, of which Meera Sadgopal is a very senior activist with something like half a century of, I think, experience in this field. And they talk about again a theme that's, I think, very little discussed, which is the role of male midwives. You see, in particularly in the tribal in a tribal belt, It's very difficult terrain, and you see, and that's where there are some men who play this sort of gender bender type of role, and how effectively they play that role. That's what they are talking about, and what needs to be done to perhaps encourage this sort of thing and get more men to play this role wherever that is necessary. Then we have an article on Bosnia and Herzegovina by Srijan Dusanik, who is a scholar. In fact, his field is philosophy, but this is not really a philosophical piece, and he's talking about fatherhood and the sort of role that married men play as fathers, and the possibilities that exist there and the limitations. Similarly, the next piece by Valentina Utari is about Indonesian men and how they tend to participate in household work, etc., and help their partners who are in Australia. When these partners, their wives, typically on some fellowship or the other, are studying in Australia, and when they accompany them, how these men actually help them out with domestic chores, etc. But then again, when they return, their participation declines. That's what Valentina Utari points out. And finally, we come to the country to which Vanessa belongs, that is Brazil. And here we have an article which is finally about policy, whereas so far we have been mainly talking about kind of scholarly work, theoretical work, or work that's sort of at micro level, NGO type of interventions. Here perhaps I would like to hear later on more from Vanessa about this, because this seems to be a huge initiative, in fact. And this policy has been in place now for something like a decade, because it was adopted in 2009, and this policy adopted by and implemented by the government in Brazil essentially targets men in the 20 to 59 year that age group, 20 years and 59 years, and caters to their health needs specifically. So this entire article is about that experience. And when they wrote it, it had been in place only for about half a decade or so. But now 5-6 more years have gone by, and perhaps Vanessa can tell us something about it. So this is what the book is all about. And very quickly, I'll just say one or two other things and wrap up, so that I will now not return to the book and how the discourse has moved thereafter. So I'll just say a few things. Obviously, we all know that since 2014 or thereabouts, some very major new challenges have come up. Some of them old challenges which have perhaps gotten intensified, such as the backlash, etc. Susan Faludi wrote about it long time back. The backlash to feminism that has happened. But there are also new things, such as the Me Too movement. Right? I think the Me Too movement is something perhaps Vanessa would like to say something about this, because that I personally feel greatly shaken by this, because not because I was targeted in some way or implicated in it, but I saw many heads rolling in that process, including at the international level. You see, people that one sort of respected and who themselves were seen as part of the pro-feminist men's mobilization and scholarship. Not to mention, of course, many others in media, etc., around the world. Their sort of attitude the way they had conducted themselves, that was questioned, and so somehow we came to realize how deeply entrenched patriarchy is, even in the minds of those who should have known better, perhaps. So that is one. Then again, neoliberalism, it remains. This was one of the concerns we had flagged in the the sort of statement we released after the second symposium. That hasn't gone away. Of course, it's now intensified, and now it's coupled with another strange phenomenon, which is that of deglobalization, which had perhaps started already then slowly, but it has definitely picked up momentum. And this deglobalization is in some ways, I don't think it's really good for if neoliberal globalization was a problem, deglobalization is not really the solution. And then again, the rise of certain kinds of leaders in major countries, leaders who are actually negative role models, I would say, considering the sort of concerns that we have. The people who represent some kind of very sort of backward looking type of models of masculinity. So these kinds of leaders have very much come to the fore. One of them is now gone, but the others are very much in place. And so what does one do with it? And finally, of course, there is a certain kind of aggressive nationalism. There are forms of chauvinism, religious chauvinism and conservatism, etc., which have come to the fore. And I think we really need to think about that. So these are some of the concerns I wanted to raise. I'm afraid I've taken up more time than I had imagined. So what we'll now do is essentially this. Uh, I think we will soon really I would like us to soon turn to questions that we've received in the chat box. But before that, I would like to request our two main speakers to come in and perhaps say something more. They can, in fact, say, for example, Vanessa can pose some questions which she would like Amon to address, and vice versa. I will just, in this connection, just say one thing, which is this, because all of us, in a sense, represent the global South. And I think it was Vanessa who very pertinently pointed out that even today, somehow the global South is seen as a domain where there is, from where we can glean experience. Okay. And that's how, people, including scholars in the global South or even activists in the global South, somehow look at this entire region, which is really it's a vast region, and it had most of the people in the world live there, but it's only seen in terms of experience. Whereas theory, analytical tools, whether it's Foucault, whether it's Butler, or even Colonial, I would say, why not? I mean, I'm not closing the doors, of course. I'm not saying that the global South is something absolutely unique and, you can't use other categories emerging from other parts of the world. But I'm surely it's high time we started also developing our own theoretical tools. And I'll here quickly mention, I will not say anything more about it. About 20 years ago, Mrinalini Sinha, who's a scholar of Indian origin based in North America, wrote a book called Colonial Masculinity on India, during the colonial period. And there, and of course, the imperial power was Britain. And she talks about how she develops a theoretical framework within which, and she uses the term imperial social formation, and she points out how actually patriarchy was reconstructed, and what Cornell would call hegemonic masculinity was reconstructed um, within this imperial social formation. So it's not as if something was imposed by Britain on India, but they were sort of there were developments that were happening concurrently, within this imperial social formation. And so this kind of a dialectical relationship between the construction or reconstruction of patriarchies in Britain and India. So in other words, I think we do need some such concepts also, and some such debates. So perhaps Vanessa and Amon can tell us if there have been such conceptual innovations in relation to the regions which they represent. Yeah, Vanessa, so would you like to come in and say something?
Sí, muy interesantes las cosas que los compañeros han hablado. Yo creo que este es un tema complejo. En poco tiempo es difícil traer para el debate toda la complejidad que existen en estas cuestiones, en estos problemas. Pero voy a intentar aquí hacer algunos comentarios, hablar algunas reflexiones, hacer algunas reflexiones con base principalmente en la presentación de Amon, que me ha llamado la atención sobre algunos temas. Yo creo que una de las cosas que fueron común en las presentaciones fue el hecho del movimiento feminista ha tenido una influencia en el cuestionamiento de las masculinidades, en la crítica de las masculinidades. Perdone mi portuñol, algunas veces yo tengo que intentar muchas palabras para acertar. En fin, una otra cosa, yo creo que me gustaría pensar con ustedes, es el hecho de que los hombres no son un medio en este proceso de promoción de la equidad de género, en este proceso de deconstrucción del patriarcado. Yo creo que Bell Hooks, por ejemplo, que es una feminista negra de Estados Unidos, que tiene una base muy freiriana de Paulo Freire, inspirada en Paulo Freire en Brasil, ha hablado mucho sobre eso. Para ella, los hombres no son necesariamente un medio, no son un medio, son parte de la sociedad. Por eso es importante que en este proceso de construcción de género, hombres y mujeres estén trabajando para esta causa, para este problema, ¿sí? Como parte de la sociedad. Y porque también tiene más poder, los hombres son importantes. Una de las cosas también que me gustaría pensar es que yo creo que esta confusión sobre, o esta cuestión que muy se habla sobre masculinidad positiva, masculinidad tóxica, los hombres como medio, los hombres son privilegiados o los hombres son los que tienen costos de género, está muy baseada en una perspectiva que no mira cómo los procesos sociales forman el género, cómo existe una normatividad que forma hombres y mujeres y que produce una sociedad que no es igual, que produce una sociedad que tiene un modelo de ser humano que es básicamente hombre, y todas las ideas que tenemos sobre hombres son las ideas que son privilegiadas. Es un modelo blanco, es un modelo del norte global, es un modelo adulto. Entonces, es justamente esta perspectiva de universalizante sobre los seres humanos que tenemos que criticar, que es un problema. En la semana pasada tuvimos una presentación sobre masculinidades negras. Una persona que es Diogo Silva ha dicho, no exactamente en la presentación, mas él dice estas cosas en otras publicaciones también, que el termo, por ejemplo, masculinidad tóxica, o podemos pensar también como masculinidad positiva, es un termo útil, de alguna manera, para popularizar estas necesidades de transformación, para dar una visibilidad para determinados problemas. Pero yo creo que pensar solamente masculinidad tóxica o masculinidad positiva está demasiado centrado en los comportamientos de los hombres. Lo que debemos pensar es que las masculinidades, esas son palabras de Diogo Silva, yo voy a intentar hacer una pequeña traducción aquí, es que no se debe perder de vista, de mirada, no podemos olvidar, por ejemplo, que la masculinidad se constituye como un impositivo de poder y que no da para tratarla, que no da para pensarla apenas por sus efectos tóxicos. Es entonces un modo normativo de construcción, es binario, es un sistema también jerarquizante. Entonces, todo eso tiene que ser tomado en cuenta. Entonces, yo creo que la cuestión que los hombres pueden ganar no es una buena cuestión. Yo creo que esta perspectiva de ganos está demasiado individualizada, es demasiado utilitarista, incluso capitalista, no rompe con una perspectiva colonizadora también, se puede usar también este tema. Y esta perspectiva fue la que rompió la perspectiva comunitaria de los lazos comunitários. Es una perspectiva que ha importado para los países una cierta individualidad moderna en que una perspectiva de sujeto, de ser humano, fue universalizada para todas las personas. Yo creo que la cuestión es que la sociedad puede ganar y los hombres están juntos. Algunas veces nosotros vamos a perder o ganar, pero esto hace parte de cómo la sociedad se organiza. No importa las personas individualmente, porque así nosotros, en esta perspectiva de acumulación de capital o de privado en primer lugar, nosotros tenemos reproducido muchas de las cuestiones de poder. Entonces, solo para concluir esta cuestión, yo creo que estos temas muchas veces pueden ser usados como herramientas, pero no podemos olvidar que tenemos que hacer un cambio en toda la sociedad y que los hombres hacen parte de esto y que tenemos que tener una sociedad que es buena para todas las personas, más que cambios de comportamientos, de actitudes. Hay una perspectiva ético-política que tenemos que implementar, que promover. Respecto a la política de 2009 en Brasil, disculpe, Mangesh, no estoy bien informada sobre eso. En 2009 tenemos una área en el Ministerio de Salud que trataba, que era dirigida principalmente a la salud de los hombres. En esta área hacían muchos programas, muchas políticas, pero esta específicamente direccionada a los hombres jóvenes, no conozco, no sé. Hay muchas también en Brasil. Hay principalmente, en fin, actualmente en la sociedad, diferentes grupos de hombres, y como política de gobierno tuvimos algunas campañas y algunos programas que pensaron también la salud de los hombres, pero no puedo decir más que esto. Yo creo que es eso por ahora. Gracias.
Thank you so much, Vanessa, for those very helpful and deep and extended thoughts about different concepts that we engaged with in this conversation. I find them very, very useful, and I find your call to move from individualistic approaches to deconstruct hierarchies and binaries very, very helpful, because I think that's what I have found limiting in the Ugandan context and in the region generally, in the East African region. The construction of gender that closes out certain categories of the population as sort of unintelligible. I don't know whether that will be, or inconceivable. For instance, if you're talking about gender vulnerabilities, it becomes difficult for you to talk about certain categories of men being vulnerable within the gender order. So I find that call to deconstruct hierarchies and polarities and opening up space for engaging with difference very, very helpful. I talked about the idea of positive masculinities because for the people that have called upon the School of Gender Studies and finally ended on me to speak on different sessions, I have found it difficult to start from the idea of positive masculinities because it somehow does not give you a broader context of understanding what the notion of masculinities is in the first place. This whole process of social construction, the variation, the different contexts that come into play to shape the formation of different forms of masculinities, it gets lost as people focus on, we want you to talk about how men can be positive, full stop. And we only want to work with progressive and positive men. And it sort of closes possibilities. It closes down possibilities of transforming what you think is harmful if you are only focusing on looking for what is positive, that kind of thing. So I really like the scholars that you have shared and how they're engaging with that idea. And, moving forward, I was thinking that perhaps we can, as we deconstruct hierarchies and look at alternative ways of understanding these identities, I thought that thinking about being conscious of what these strategies might bring upon might be one of the things that might be helpful. Yes, you're going to have a number of strategies, but keeping an eye on these strategies and what is changing, because these identities change, masculinities change when contexts change. We have had cases where men who identify as role models, male champions within the world of activism, they support one gender equity reform in parliament. The next day, they oppose another. They supported legislation against domestic violence. In the next month, they resisted a law that was suggesting distribution of property in marriage relations, a bill that was proposing women's rights to property in marriage relationships. And so the question came to, okay, what happens then to these men that we had already crowned champions of gender equality now that they are resisting another form? So that kind of consciousness, to keep an eye on how a strategy is evolving and making sure that as men we remain accountable to the goals of gender equality without selectively choosing what we are going to promote and then choosing what we are going to challenge. So that is what I wanted to pick up from your wonderful contribution discussion that you brought forth. I want to raise a question to Mangesh, especially given the history that you have given us around the area of critical studies of masculinities. We have started a course on critical masculinities at Makerere University within the School of Gender Studies. I think it has run for 4 years now, but we seem to get a challenge where we're still struggling with whether we should explore experiences of men centrally in gender discourse. There's that fear that a shift towards, or an expansion towards that critical study is going to erode certain engagement in feminist studies and that kind of thing. So you find people who are uncomfortable within the same school, people uncomfortable with this approach. So in some ways, you don't know how to engage without raising those anxieties and tensions on, are we rolling back the gains of feminist scholarship by focusing on critical masculinity studies? So I don't know what you have experienced from your years of teaching critical masculinities. That is a challenge that we are struggling with. It seems there is a thin line between advancing critical studies of masculinities and the thinking that this could be a backlash in its own within feminist studies.
Right. Amon, I think you've raised a very important question that is dear to my heart. And that is something that, it's a sort of challenge that's not new to me, really. Because, as I said, I got involved in this field of what has now come to be called critical masculinity studies. That was in the 90s when I started. And that's when I experienced this kind of resistance or reaction from feminists, women, but also some men, I must say. They did not like this idea of critical masculinity studies or focus on men more generally, even in activism. Somehow, or they were a bit wary about it, let's say, precisely for the reasons that you mentioned. Remember, that was already, when some sort of a backlash had begun, right? They were also, especially in the West, but slowly here in India, see, already in the 90s, there were men's rights groups, right? I don't really, I'm not sure about Africa, but they are there in Europe, they have been there in the US. And independently, a sort of men's rights kind of mobilization began in India in the 1990s, precisely in response to what were seen as otherwise, what were positively seen as gains of feminism. And I mean, I'll just give you one example. What is it that they're opposing? And essentially, they are in that mode, oppositional mode. And what are they opposing? They are opposing laws and policies that they think favor women in an unjust way, a way that is unjust to men. I'll just give you one example. In 1983 or thereabouts, the Indian Penal Code was slightly amended, and there actually there was an addition made, and that addition was about treating domestic violence or violence inflicted on a married woman in the marital home, treating it as a very serious kind of crime with stiff punishment. Now, when this happened, and as that began to be implemented by the 1990s, there was clear backlash, and these men's rights groups, in fact, were formed to a great extent in response to this. And they started saying that women are misusing this law, and they are using it to harass us men and to harass the husband and his relatives, etc., etc. So this has been a major bone of contention. And in fact, over the years, actually, the sphere of anti-domestic violence legislation and more generally, legislation that seeks to protect women from violence in different spheres, at the workplace, in educational institutions, in public spaces, and all that. This kind of legislation, the scope has has expanded, and so these men have now more grievances also. Now, considering this sort of background, and considering of course, the persistence of patriarchy, then you see, many in that context, many feminists, as I said, mainly women, but some men also, started saying that this emphasis on men and critical masculinity studies, etc., is like taking over spaces which we had women and feminists had created and nurtured with great effort And now men are also entering these spaces, taking over. They are themselves now becoming experts in so-called experts in gender studies, etc. They're beginning to redefine gender studies, as it were, and especially in the domain of activism, this remains a major concern even today for many. I think that the fear was that these groups working with men, or supposedly working with men, would divert and attract and divert funds, you see, and attract funds and divert them from women's organizations. So these kinds of concerns were there. But see, what I have seen here in India is this, that I think slowly but surely it became clear that what one might call mainstream critical masculinity studies, this field itself is essentially inspired by feminism.
Yeah.
And so, therefore, I think that resistance somewhat declined when they actually saw that, what is it that these people engaged in critical masculinity studies, what are they talking about? What are their concerns? What are their politics? Then somehow that resistance declined. And let me quickly point out at this stage that, especially here in India, these scholars, okay, who have contributed to critical masculinity studies, interestingly, I would say many of them, the most prominent amongst them, are actually women. I gave you one example a while ago. This lady who wrote a book called it's called Colonial Masculinity. And this is a woman historian of
Yeah.
Indian origin based in the US, and there are many others. Okay, let me mention just one other name. This person is Radhika Chopra, who is a sociologist and social anthropologist based in Delhi, and who is a pioneer of critical masculinity studies here in the academic field. Right. So she, for example, many years ago, she edited a volume that's called South Asian Masculinities, and she started a course in this field in Delhi University. Perhaps it was the first course of its kind. So, in other words, uh, so therefore, and they see, those of us who have been involved in critical masculinity studies have taken a clear position against men's rights groups and such other sort of reactionary type of tendencies, and we have clearly cast our lot with feminism and the women's movement, and therefore I think have found acceptance. And plus, I appreciate something else, which is this. See, many of the really good, capable, feminist inspired women's organizations post 2000, particularly, I've seen they themselves, launched programs to engage with men. So, in a sense, now you see, they kind of began to find this something that was necessary and useful, directly addressing men, involving men, in addition to their other initiatives. So, and these are organizations led by women. They essentially have feminist concerns. They have great deal of credibility in that particular area of gender activism. So I think I feel therefore very good about this. That this
Yeah.
has happened, and I think even see there are many women's studies departments and centers in this country. It all started in '74. The first women's studies center came up then, and then we have many of them. And the good ones, I have in, by the way, in my university, we have a center, I think, which is really good. And though it's small, and they are often, they have these problems of funding and other things, getting enough academic positions and so on. But they are so committed. They are these. They have a small staff, but they're very committed, and they keep the flag of feminism flying. Really, and they have launched and participated in so many interdisciplinary debates. At this moment, actually, I have here. I'm still in my office, and here behind me, there is a sort of a petition that these women's studies people have sort of circulated. And because our university is being reorganized along in terms of schools, so departments are being bunched together and new schools are formed. So they have been placed in a school called School of Social Justice. Okay. And now they have this petition and they are saying that we want to be in the School of Social Sciences, because that is where we draw our conceptual tools, etc. And in turn we contribute to debates within the larger domain of social sciences, etc. So, they are very active and they are very energetic, and they are not afraid to uh, take up these various kinds of new themes, including critical masculinity. So, I think it's a question of perspective. It's a question of how we integrate the study of men and masculinities within the broader field of gender. It's not a question of whether we should do it, but how we should do it. And as long as we are very clear about our feminist commitments and feminist tools of analysis and so on and so forth, there need be no fear of any kind. Having said that, I want to end this, and uh, we will surely now take up questions from the chat box. But even as we do it, there's one thing that has kind of, been, how shall I put it, sort of bothering me. Perhaps Vanessa, I don't know if she mentioned it, but if she did, then forgive me. But um, I have a feeling that our conversation this evening, because it's here now, it's 8:30, 8:20 p.m. actually. Elsewhere, it could be morning or something like that, midday. So this conversation has been rather binary. And that has also to do with, of course, our title in a certain sense. But it's not just that. I'm sure many, who work with or themselves belong to the LGBTQ, etc., that sort of gender politics, that kind of gender politics. We all do, in fact, but those who feel more intensely about that, they might feel a little unhappy with our approach that seems to be binary. I'm sure we don't mean it that way, but this is the other thing I want to say, that a properly comprehensive, critical sort of gender studies program, and even strategy, comprehensive critical strategy of gender activism, would have to integrate all these. And it's not just add and stir, I think, really. It calls for a great deal of theoretical imagination and activist kind of effort to genuinely integrate the concerns of women and the concerns of the whole idea of reforming patriarchal masculinities, and the also doing all this in tandem with the concerns of the LGBTQ community, in order to finally, in the long term, dismantle patriarchy. I know it's very easily said, dismantling patriarchy. That's not a joke, but at least we should be moving in that direction. It's not easy. It's an extremely difficult task. Perhaps the most difficult task that humanity has faced in terms of social transformation, I would say. But we should be moving and seen to be moving in that direction. And that has a space, very important critical activist and theoretical space for LGBTQ and other sorts of identities. So I just wanted to put that on the table. And then perhaps now our MC maybe would he like to share with us questions in the chat box, or how does it go now?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thank you all. But yeah, there are not much questions as say, but there are some. Savita had asked the role of religion in changing the construction of masculinities, or sort of reconstruction of masculinity sometime, but she has left, unfortunately. But it appears that we are going back instead of moving forward. In many countries, this role is taking another form of strengthening discrimination, inequality, exploitation, and violence. What are your thoughts on dealing with religion? And then Stella had a question to Amon in specific, on the point on using positive masculinities. How has this come about that we categorize men as cause of negative impact on women? What went wrong and what's behind all of this? And also Osvaldo sort of agrees to your analysis on the use of positive masculinities as a concept to then make it more, let me see what exactly he had written is, sort of keeps us in a simplistic moral mindset of right and wrong, but that needs to go beyond. And there are some Spanish ones. Maybe may I ask someone in the team, or maybe Osvaldo, if you don't mind, to let us know what the comments in Spanish are. And then Cesaruddin also asks, what are common in men in the world apart from biological similarities? And then Stella also adds on to the recent UN Security Council Resolution 2467 is very instructive in an exploitative way regarding male vulnerability issue.
Yes, I can summarize some of the comments in Spanish from Miguel from Peru, I think. He's reflecting that in his country, many times feminist groups in some way blame men for inequality, for gender inequality, as the sole responsibles of gender inequality, and the only one who need to change, and that they don't take into account how men are also negatively affected by maleness, manhood. How can we change that mentality, he asks.
Yeah, and there's one more, no? Osvaldo, from your side, your reflection, what was that?
And I was reflecting on Vanessa's point about using the concept of toxic masculinity, positive masculinity as a tool. I was agreeing with her that it's understandable to use it as a tool, but not as a absolute truth. And always mindful that even though we might use it as a tool, we need a structural analysis, as these speakers are explaining to us.
Yeah, thank you, Osvaldo. And then still a program on true gender equality on peace and security in Africa. What would be the best title? Men, women, girls, boys, LGBT plus. And then the last question I had was also in the context of recent conversation. If we are then talking about critical masculinities studies as a separate sector or a unit or a course, then how does it relate to the existing women's and gender studies and units in the academia? And if it's not relating, and then that is a concern, exactly, that this sort of studies is taking over the space, and how should we look at addressing them? Yeah, that's all.
Okay, thank you. So actually, we are left with something like 5 minutes. So maybe if there are any quick responses from our main speakers. Vanessa, would you like to say something?
Yo quiero solamente hacer destacar algunas de las cosas que fueron dichas por muchas personas aquí. Yo creo que una de las cosas es sobre la relación entre el movimiento, si hay un movimiento exactamente, como una vez me ha preguntado Marcos Nascimento, de los hombres por la equidad de género, sobre la participación de los hombres en la equidad de género y el movimiento feminista. Yo creo que el gran problema es siempre cómo este trabajo es hecho, como ha dicho Mangesh. Pero la cuestión sobre la importancia o el rol de los hombres en este debate es prácticamente acordada entre las mujeres, entre las feministas sobre todo. Yo creo que esta relación entre esta participación es que es importante de pensar. Sobre también alguna cosa que Mangesh ha mencionado, de la cuestión del binarismo, sí, de facto, yo hice también una crítica en esto cuando yo hablé sobre las masculinidades siguiendo como centrales en este proceso de cambio cuando utilizamos esta cuestión, vamos a transformar las masculinidades de aquí hasta aquí, siempre pensando en las masculinidades. Pero yo creo que este es un debate que tenemos que hacer, y para hacer este debate, para pensar sobre los problemas, sobre las cuestiones, tenemos que mencionar esto, tenemos que poner algunos destaques en algunas cuestiones para hacer la crítica, y yo creo que nosotros estamos haciendo de esta manera, mencionando, analizando una cosa que existe. Y quería también concordar con Osvaldo Montoya cuando menciona también una charla de Amon sobre esta perspectiva moralizante, muy moralizante cuando pensamos en cierto y errado. Por eso mencionaba también la importancia de una perspectiva ética, política, en que estamos trabajando por una sociedad con algunas características de esta perspectiva ética política, como una sociedad con oportunidad para todas las personas. En fin, hay muchas cosas, como el tiempo está corto, voy a quedarme por aquí. Muchas gracias por escucharme.
Thanks, Vanessa. Thank you, Vanessa. Amon, do you have anything to say? Just maybe a minute, couple of minutes.
Yes, I'll briefly talk about the role of religion in constructing masculinity or reconstructing masculinity. I think, as Mangesh had already indicated, the deep-seated nature of patriarchy, I think it goes across different institutional spaces, and religion is one of those spaces in which, quite often female voice is marginalized within religious discourses. But we have started to see both at the activism level and through practice, gender practitioners bringing religious institutions on board. For instance, in Uganda, we have had religious leaders and within their forum, different religions, having conversations with UN women on how to move towards transforming negative stereotypes and practices that infringe on women's rights. I have also, on one of those occasions, invited to look at what the role of men could be in religion, in Christianity, what the role of men could be in preventing gender-based violence. So these conversations have started going into a discourse that was sort of closed and repulsive of conversations on gender equality. So there is hope that as we move towards transforming deep-seated structures of patriarchy, these conversations can create inroads. There was also a question on positive masculinity. How did we get to this? I cited the Ugandan case, how the history of women's subordination was really deep-rooted and widespread in the home, in the public politics, and so that kind of oppression across different phases, it creates a semblance of victim perpetrator. And of course, in the history of feminist engagement, the approaches that we started with, focusing on women exclusively as people who were missing in development, the women in development, scored in terms of creating achievements, highlighting women's issues into the public realm, but it also produced inadvertent effects on what we came to know as gender and what we came to know as the powerful and privileged men, and women as victims of men's violence. But I think as we moved into understanding gender as a relational concept, we have moved into much more broader intersectional contexts where we need to move beyond positive and negative and that kind of thing. So there is that history, but we have since moved to where we need to understand the complexities of gender relations. Thank you so much.
Amon, I think that's a very good note on which to end the complexity of gender relations and the intersectionality. And so whether we are talking about, critical masculinity studies and the question that was raised by Lakshman, for example, or whether we are talking of the future of what we have called work with men, it will, I think, really depend upon grappling successfully with these and in an sort of emancipatory framework with this complexity in terms of how we can link both the study of masculinities and work with masculinities, how we can link them up with the larger study of and struggle against racism, class inequality and exploitation, majoritarianism, and of course, heteropatriarchy. How this can be done, and this I think can only be, there isn't any ready-made framework, honestly. I think can be all from whichever location we inhabit, we must really engage with this particular challenge in a twofold manner. I mean, on the one hand, we shouldn't lose sight of the larger global perspective. And I use the term global both theoretically, and it's not just a geographical expression, but global as in a comprehensive perspective. We should always be in dialogue across our regions and borders, geographical and theoretical. But also, of course, we must also be deeply and creatively engaged with our own specific contexts and the challenges that it poses and the possibilities that it creates. Because I think only genuine theoretical and activist creativity at this level, this will then eventually feed into a sort of a larger movement of scholarship and activism. And because I don't think we're going to get any sort of perspective, ready-made perspective, or a perspective fashioned solely at the global level, which we can simply adopt, be it positive masculinity or whatever it is, inclusive masculinity that Anderson was talking about a while ago, etc. But that it will have to be so. This is, in other words, what I would call, in every sense, work in progress. Okay, work in progress, and I'm optimistic that we will eventually, be able to move slowly but surely closer to the goal of creating a truly just society, including a gender just society, because there can never be justice without gender justice. So, having said that, let me now thank, of course, both the speakers, also our host and anchor, Lakshman, and his colleagues, the technical team that supported this.